Hello and welcome to this Intelligence Squared Plus event with me, Jenny Kleeman. I am delighted to introduce our guests tonight. We have with us Felix Marquardt. He is an Austrian-American writer born and raised in Paris, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Time, among others. He is the author of the new book, The New Nomads, How the Migration Revolution is Making the World a Better Place. We also have David Goodhart. He is a journalist, commentator and author. He's the founder and former editor of Prospect magazine. His books include The Road to Somewhere and, most recently, Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century. I'm just going to run through how this event is going to work tonight. It's going to run for about an hour. For the first 30 minutes, I'm going to be in conversation with Felix and David. And then in the second part, we are going to go over to your questions. You can start now if you've got some questions now you want us to look at by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and typing in your question. If you want your name to be mentioned, make sure you include that. You can ask questions throughout our conversation, throughout all of our discussion. And as Connor said, if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag to do that is hashtag IQ2. So perhaps we should begin with, obviously we're living through very, very strange times. Migration hasn't really been possible in a conventional sense, in a legal sense, as a result of the pandemic for the past 14, 15 months. So I want to ask both of you to begin with how the pandemic has changed your view of migrants and migration, beginning perhaps with David.
It hasn't really changed my view of migration at all. Why should it? I mean, it's true there has been less movement of people. I suppose to the extent that there are sort of general political impulses that have sort of been revealed by the pandemic. I mean, they've been quite socially conservative ones and quite social democratic ones. I mean, this has been the hour of the nation state. International institutions have not covered themselves in glory, the EU, the WHO, and so on. Indeed, it is likely, at least in the short and medium term, to lead to some pushback against sort of what Danny Roderick calls hyper-globalization, particularly when it comes to things like producing PPE equipment close to home. The idea that these long supply chains are not always to our advantage. So I think it's reinforced the nation state. So I suppose that is going to be a force pushing somewhat against greater openness. I don't think it's going to lead to any great upsurge in protectionism or xenophobia. Or indeed, it's quite remarkable in some ways. I mean, how the sort of how kind of pretty sort of liberal attitudes have been revealed. I mean, I haven't heard anybody sort of saying, well, why do we have the Indian variant so widespread in this country? Does it have anything to do with that? We have a very large British Indian minority. I mean, I suspect it does have something to do with that. But I mean, nobody is sort of picking on people. We've probably got about 1 million illegal immigrants in this country, and you'd have thought that when there's a sort of pandemic raging, you'd have thought that might become an issue, but it hasn't become an issue. So I think it is it's reinforcing the nation state, somewhat socially conservative, certainly social democratic. I mean, the way the state has put its arm around us all and paid people's wages and so on. It's been a very sort of Keynesian social democratic moment in that sense. So, but yeah, I mean, perhaps in the medium term, the reinforcement of the nation state, which broadly speaking, I favour. I mean, I think hyperglobalization has gone too far. The nation state has been weakened too much, and large-scale immigration is part of that package. So, yeah, perhaps in the medium term, it will contribute to something of a reduction in flows, but who knows?
Felix, has anything changed when it comes to migration because of the pandemic?
Well, obviously, thank you, Jenny. Obviously, it's changed in the very short term a lot. But I think what I think the pandemic is changing everything. And I think that it's going to take us many years to understand just how much it has changed everything. I think one of the biggest things that it's changing is that it's making us aware of the complexity and entanglement of issues that so far modernity has encouraged us, or that we've just found comforting to look at as separate issues. So, you know, once and for all, it's obvious to everyone that what happens in a lab in Wuhan can have consequences for everyone around the world. But it's also entangling, it's also allowing us to see that things that we've found comfortable for our narratives, our national narratives, our global narrative as a civilization, the great progressive narrative, it's showing us that the stories that we've been telling ourselves are broken. And this has an impact, of course, and this will have an impact on migration. Because what we're seeing is that, you know, in a way, the narrative that has become the dominant narrative of modernity is that we have a functioning system, and unfortunately, some external events, the wrong people getting elected or taking power, or cyclones and natural disasters, or the financial crisis, or climate change, come and rock an otherwise pretty smooth sailing ship. And I think what the pandemic has made apparent, and is making, and it's an inkling that most people have, although they don't always know how to, you know, how to formulate it, how to explain it, is that the crises in question are not external. They are the product, they are the consequence of the violent and unsustainable practices that we've been calling normal, you know? And so in a way, what's happening with the pandemic is that people, I would argue, like David, whom I've often thought of as a pragmatist, in a way is not at all a pragmatist, because if you read the analyses of David, there's something that's missing in the picture. And that is that the latest figures from climate scientists, the French ones who work for the IPCC, regarding the highest possible temperature rises between now and between the pre-industrial temperatures and 2100 are +7 degrees Celsius. +7 degrees Celsius means that life on Earth, between the island in the Aegean where I live and where I'm speaking to you from, and Kinshasa, is pretty much impossible, or at least extraordinarily uncomfortable for humans. This means that, you know, this notion that, you know, we can just look at the national realm and find solutions on how we want to live at the national realm are completely nuts. And so actually, what I would argue is that the real pragmatists are the people who are thinking really hard about what does it mean to be in a world that simply cannot process that in 78 years, this might be the situation on planet Earth? Because the experts at the Resilience Center in Stockholm say that that means that there's 2 to 3 billion humans who are no longer around. So who's the pragmatist?
David, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, Felix is setting up a completely ridiculous straw man. I mean, you can believe in the significance of the nation state and also in the importance of international cooperation on things like climate change, obviously. I mean, you know, I can't write about everything. I mean, I don't write about the environment, at least not primarily. I mean, I'm aware of the issue, but if what Felix says is true, then I think it will again reinforce the nation state. It'll not weaken it. I mean, the causes of these things may be global, but the solutions will have to be driven through national policies coordinated across the most important carbon consuming countries. And it will also require a world of considerably less movement. So you know, a kind of, you know, Felix's happy world of us all becoming nomads, I'm afraid, is completely ruled out by his own bleak environmental prognosis.
May I pick up on that? I think there's a huge misunderstanding in the actual in what nomadism is.
What
and
is
I think this is I think where I really appreciated and enjoyed and thought the Road to Somewhere was a really fascinating book. And I think what's been lost on especially urban liberals is that traveling around the world at very rapid speed you know, just hopping around and having you know, a house here and a house there and working from your laptop on XYZ beach, etc. That's not nomadism. The word nomad comes from the word nomos. The word nomos is the pasture. And by extension only, it comes from nomas, which is the act of wandering on said pasture. And I think what I would argue is that the somewheres and the anywheres described by David, these are, and as he pointed out in that book, the distinction, the limit between the two, the frontier is porous. And most of us need to feel, we sense instinctively the importance of place. But at the same time, we don't really know who we are until we leave home. We simply don't. And one of the worst things I would argue that can happen is if we continue today to pretend that we can know where we stand in the human trajectory without leaving home. And the author Martin Shaw, who's a good friend, makes a very interesting distinction between being of a place or from a place, and of a place. And it's important eventually for all of us to become of a place and to learn about the community, its culture, to connect with our surroundings. It's a very, again, sort of, if you think of the nomad as the creature of the pasture, the nomad is not someone who's just obsessed with high-speed mobility. the nomad is profoundly curious and connecting. You know, like we spent 98% of our time on Earth in small groups of less than 100 roaming around, but we roamed around very slowly. And we were, you know, at the core experts of our surroundings. And if we weren't, we died very fast because it cost, you know, it was a life and death thing. And I think what I think is dead and a victim of COVID that no one will really regret is that, you know, is the Uber nomad, the hyper nomad, the digital nomad, the, you know, this creature who surfs opportunistically whatever place has something to give to it, but actually never really engages with the local context. But that is not nomadism, and that is not that is not, I think, what indeed that's not the.
Well, but Felix, I mean,
please.
I mean, I enjoyed your book, but I was kind of a little bit puzzled by it because you kind of said in it that you'd had this epiphany and you were no longer the kind of thoughtless, sort of disengaged nomad. And yet the book is still essentially a celebration of kind of leaving and of going out into the world and exploring it, and that's kind of all well and good, but it doesn't sort of tell us anything about how we should manage migration between nations, or what level is appropriate. And also towards the end of the book, I found this actually rather useful definition of a useful but very kind of restricted definition of what you're talking about, which is, I mean, you kind of describe migration stroke nomadism as meaningful time away from home. And actually that made me think about Bowlby's attachment theory. I mean, when he's sort of talking about, you know, the psychologist, British psychologist, the 50s, 60s, he's a bit unpopular now because of his stress on the attachment, primary attachment between baby and mother, which has been seen as sort of oppressive by a certain strand of feminism. But he talks about how we do get, you know, the baby goes out into the world on a kind of piece of elastic, and feels secure when it can return to its sort of home base, which is its mother. But you know, gradually as it sort of grows and becomes a toddler, the piece of elastic sort of grows longer, and sort of human beings are like that, I think. And yeah, I mean, most of us do. You know, we all like going on holiday, you know, going to different places and experiencing that. And some people like to, you know, leave their country and live in another country. Although I think about 3% of the world's population live in a country other than one they were born in. It's a tiny percentage of people who do that. But like I say, I mean, I didn't really see the results of the epiphany, except perhaps you were kind of recognizing some of the strength of the argument of the other side, which is you know, good and open-minded of you. But what I felt you did was sort of convert, as it were, just adapt your definition of this highly mobile sort of nomad world from the kind of careless nomad to the engaged and careful nomad. But we're still talking about, you're still presenting a model of a world in which, you know, the largest possible number of people are living this very highly mobile life. Is that fair?
Before you come to answer that, Felix, I want to remind the audience to keep your questions coming in the Q&A tab in the bottom, and I want you to answer that, Felix. But I also want to move us on to this idea of this backlash against immigration that we've seen certainly over the past 10 years in Europe. If you look at Hungary, if you look at Britain, often from populations that don't actually have large numbers of migrants within them. And I want you to touch on that. Why do you think that's happening? Is it, you know, are there genuine concerns that need to be listened to, or is it all just something that's being amplified by certain sections of the media?
Which one of us?
No,
Felix.
Felix.
So I really don't think that this is, amplified in a way that is, that doesn't reflect a real misgivings from the population. I think it's a reaction to, again, I would say a broader set of issues. When I hear David describe sort of what he's focused on, political scientists tend to look at the last 300 years and sort of explain most of what's happening today based on those 200-300 years at best. To be honest, I would argue many political scientists argue that what's going on today can be explained by what happened in the past 50 years. And the truth of the matter is that I guess, like, to answer your question, David, I've adopted the lenses a bit more of an anthropologist, and I'm looking at things with a bit more perspective. I feel that trying to explain the world, looking at the past few centuries, it's again like it says this is realistic, but what it is a bit childish. I mean, it just doesn't, I would argue that, again, if you look at things from a greater perspective, we have been sedentary creatures for just 10,000 years. And, the vast majority of our time on Earth has been very differently. I'm not arguing let's go back to living in caves or on trees. But I think that something in our worldview changed when we became sedentary creatures, and that something is killing us today. So to come back to your question, Jenny, I think that if you look at these reactions, if you look at many other reactions, sometimes violent, or if you look at conspiracy theories or the rise of religious fundamentalism, and all these things I see as reactions to modernity. They are reactions to a narrative, which is that goes something along, it's the Rosling-Pinker narrative, which says, 300, 400 years ago, a bunch of white dudes in Europe, through sheer ingenuity and brilliance, discovered a few things. And since then, we've been building on that. And it's been getting better and better for most people, or actually not for most people, but for the best possible number of people. And it's an unequal progress, and it's not working. It's not working out perfectly, but this is the best game in town, and that's about it. And some have been left behind, but most, again, this is the best game in town. And I think that more and more people are realizing that this narrative is very self-serving. It doesn't take into account the fact that those who were so-called, so to speak, left behind weren't left behind. They are where they are, the places in the world that we don't want migrants from. They are there where they are because people in the places where we live are living the way we live and have built the way the societies that we have built. There is now a really significant amount of research about how the crops of places, of the colonies, India and China, among others, were confiscated from local populations and shipped the first time that the world was global in Victorian England, were shipped to Britain, to Leeds, to Liverpool, to Manchester, to fuel the birth of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. Mm. And that led to, I think, the figure in between 1890, 1892, that led to tens of millions of people dying from famine all over these ex-colonies. And in a way, to a large extent, what we've been calling the third world is not really, you know, it was not left behind. It was produced by the revolution that we heralded. So I think it's really a question of perspective on things. And also, I think that when David says, you know, I can't focus on everything, climate is one issue, I'm like, no, climate is not one issue. Climate is the shitstorm that it's the mother of all issues. Everything else is a joke. If we don't, as a matter of absolute urgency, if we don't stop othering each other, we will go on othering nature. And if we go on considering that we are not part of one metabolism, what's going to happen is the doomsday scenario that I described earlier on.
I want to give David a chance to respond to that, but I also, David, I'd like to hear your perspective on why you think there has been this backlash against migration over the past 10 years, certainly in Europe. Is this just a disaffection, a reaction to modernity?
Yeah, well, it's a reaction to the kind of excesses of liberal modernity, I think, in many ways. The feeling of many people, perhaps particularly poorer, less successful people in rich countries, who feel that social contracts have been challenged in some ways by large-scale immigration. And I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of modern liberalism is that it's too readily embraced change, partly because of the sort of nomad worldview that Felix talks about. I mean, one of the problems with Felix's whole argument is that he's basically won. I mean, the liberal anywheres, in my language, who've dominated our societies for the last 25 years or so, it's, particularly reinforced by mass higher education. They are the people who believe very strongly in openness, in mobility, in autonomy. They tend to be very individualistic, and they, highly educated people tend to be comfortable with novelty and change and enjoy it and want more of it. And the openness that they have brought about in our societies through relatively open immigration, at least until this backlash, I think has the over dominance of that worldview has been part of the problem, because a very large minority, if not a majority, of people, even in very rich societies where most people are reasonably well educated up to a certain level, but it's a kind of personality trait of at least 50% of the population, is that actually they prefer stability and security and familiarity. Of course, they also like to go on holiday, and they like change within a sort of controlled environment. And I think a lot of those people have felt that society's been changing too fast. There's a kind of right-wing version of that, which has been the overconfident embrace of the creative destruction of modern capitalism, the kind of the story that led to the disappearance of an industrial culture in this country in the space of about 10 or 15 years. The over-rapid deindustrialization, even compared to other European countries. Say, compare what happened in industrial Lancashire and Yorkshire to what happened in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. I mean, we destroyed whole industries almost overnight. They did it much more gradually. And on the left, I think the kind of the liberal mistake has focused on too great an openness to population change, essentially. You know, if you live in a suburb of London and over a period of sort of 10 or 15 years, it changes it, the population of it changes by 50%. And so, you know, suddenly half the people in the street are speaking a language you don't know, particularly you're an older person. This is uncomfortable to many people. You don't have to be xenophobic or malevolent to feel that. So I think there's a sort of right-wing version of the kind of over-eager embrace of change, and there's a sort of left-wing or liberal version of it. But I think, you know, that worldview was dominant, and in various forms there's been a pushback against it. Brexit here, Trump in America, various forms of populism in some of it legitimate, some of it less legitimate forms of populism in continental Europe. But I think one can go too far as well. I mean, you know, a lot of people would say backlash. What backlash? I mean, you know, at least until the pandemic, you know, immigration in this country was still running at kind of net 300,000 a year. This government has liberalized student migration. It's returned to the system we had before, where students were allowed to stay on for 2 years after they'd studied. We've opened our doors in principle to, I can't remember how many millions of Hong Kong Chinese who might come here. I mean, this is hardly a vicious backlash against human mobility, but nonetheless, I think it's in the context of a government that has pursued Brexit and understands that part of the issue with Brexit was to do with immigration. But I don't, I think in a perfectly legitimate way, people felt that the social contract was undermined, because the problem, particularly with modern forms of immigration, we're not talking so much about immigration from developing countries, but immigration, white Europeans coming here. There's a selection process, isn't there? The people that come here tend to be the most energetic and ambitious, and they leapfrog over the local population, much of the local population, and so people have a sort of sense that their national citizenship has been kind of diluted, that it's become less meaningful in some ways, precisely because it's less controlled. It's less, and you see this in this point about how people are very anti-immigration in places where there is virtually no immigration. That, I think, is the answer to that it's not so much about immigration, it's where you stand in the social contract. And you see this most vividly of all, of course, in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, which is the most hostile to immigration of anywhere in Europe and has the least immigration. But what they have is emigration. So their elites have buggered off to Britain and America and France and Germany and kind of left them behind. And they're thinking, well, we don't really like this. I mean, it's a sort of failure, you might say, of noblesse oblige. The elites, or the dominant, the educated, the better off people in the society are not treating the ordinary people in the way that in a democracy people think they should be treated.
I'm going to take your questions in a moment. Do keep them coming. You can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. But before we do, I wanted to put a question to Felix. You recently wrote that Davos is dead and coronavirus killed it. Can you explain what you mean by that, and what we can learn from it? What impact that should have on our thinking?
I think that I used to attend the World Economic Forum a lot, and there's a sense that there's a number of ways in which modern thinking has proven we're realizing just certain things that we've been doing don't work. And again, sort of the pandemic has been an extraordinarily agent to allow us to realize some of those things. And among others, there is this idea that if we gather the whole world in one place at the top of a mountain for 3 days, and those people that we gather are truly committed to improving the state of the world, as the motto of the World Economic Forum puts it, then good things will happen. It's sort of the ideological equivalent of trickle-down economics. And And the truth is that the work that we have done, that we need to do, in my opinion, and in that column, I bring up the fact that I have a history a history with substance addiction. And I believe that the way we are, what we require today to, what we're dealing with, whether it's climate change or, the structural inequality of our world and a number of other issues that we're confronted with. These are not problems. Problems can be solved. They're like, arithmetic for 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds. What we're dealing with here are predicaments. Predicaments, they're like addiction. You can respond to them in a healthy or unhealthy way in gradation, but they don't go away. And this idea that anything can be tackled if we just put our minds together, and we just sort of spend 3 days thinking and talking together, that just does not work. And I compare it in that article to an ayahuasca ceremony without proper guidance and without proper follow-up. It feels amazing when you do it. I haven't tried that drug specifically, but you go home and a week later you feel like what the hell was that? Like I thought I came back full of hope and a new man, and a week later I'm not a new man or woman, and I feel terrible and nothing's changed. And I think it's time for, if you take this metaphor of addiction, if we have indeed become addiction, as I suspect we have, to growth, to extraction, to carbon, and if the best predictor of a person, a company, a country, or a household's carbon footprint is how much money they spend, then asking people who are the richest people in the world, or at the helm of the companies who spend the most money in the world, to lead the intervention we so sorely require, then what we're doing is we're asking people with the best heroin on the block to lead the intervention. It's insane, and it cannot work. And we need to stop asking these people to deliver anything resembling the kind of sobriety and maturity and discernment that these predicaments require of us.
I'm going to take a question from the floor now. This is a question for David. Do you think, David, there is a country which has the right balance of nationalism and internationalism?
I think probably this country has a reasonably good balance of it. I mean, I guess it's sort of easier for small countries to balance it. I mean, small countries often have the feel of being a kind of extended family. I mean, the kind of Irelands and Denmarks and Austrias, Sweden maybe, where and also perhaps particularly countries that don't have or they have a past which is sort of less complicated than countries that have been very dominant in the world, like Britain. So maybe a country like Ireland, but like I say, smaller countries have a sort of have a particular advantage, you might say, but particularly looking at it from a kind of more liberal perspective. But I think we've got a pretty good balance between the national and the international. I mean, we're a very, very open country, very, really significant minorities now from lots of other parts of the world, attached to, even despite Brexit, still deeply embedded in all sorts of international institutions, and of course, through the former empire and Commonwealth, we have almost unparalleled global connections, which are clearly valued. So, but we've also, and I think perhaps particularly now, I think we've responded to the kind of the democratic impulse that things were kind of moving too fast and perhaps being a bit too open, and so I think we're also balancing that openness and internationalism with a kind of reinforcement of, you might say, sort of the value of national citizenship.
There's a question for you, Felix, from Flip Webster, who says, Felix, surely nomads move on. What Western cultures have is migrants from other countries for economic reasons, and these people stay and rarely go, in inverted commas, home. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that the metaphor of nomadism to describe migration has its limits, is the first thing I would answer. Some people come for economic reasons, and there's, again, I think if you look at the immediate picture and you say, well, you're coming from a poor country, sorry about that, not great, but our country's doing much better, and we can't really, we're sorry, we're there's no space for you guys. I think it makes sense, again, if you look at just the past decades, and you just completely abstract the rest of the human trajectory. But if you look at why the people who are in those countries are in why the economies of those countries are in the state that they are, if you look at the fact that Africa today produces about 4 to 5% of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions for 17% of the population. And whereas the 20% richest humans produce 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And you see that in the coming years, people are going to be moving more and more for that reason, because it's actually you're not just poor when you live in those countries, you're dying of climate change. Then, when you realize that these countries are in the state that they are in because we've been flourishing, again, like the problem with our narrative, with the progressive narrative, is that it's this unified story that somehow there was a global level playing field, and some countries got ahead and the others didn't, and we're really sorry, but we're going to have to close the borders. Well, I mean, that's just nuts. That's not the story. They were not left behind. They were their situation was produced by us. So saying, because it's 300 years ago, well, it's a long time ago. Again, it's a long time ago if you look at the time frame of a political scientist. If you look at the time frame of an anthropologist, it's half a second ago. And we need to pay attention to this. And I don't say it because I'm an idealist. I say it again because my daughter, who's 3 years old, will be around in 2100. And the way we are rationalizing the insanity of our present as rational, as normal, is leading us to absolute disaster. We can't afford it.
David, this leads on. There's a question that I want to come to, and you can come back on that. But the question is to you, and I think it's relevant. Somebody has asked, do you not think it's hypocritical to say we need to help the left behind, but not want to help the left behind who happen to live in another geographical place?
Well, I never said we shouldn't help the left behind who live in another geographical place. We have, even with the recent reduction, we have one of the highest levels of development aid of any country in the rich world. And I mean, I do take issue with, Felix, if you feel so strongly about climate change, why the hell didn't you write a book about climate change? I mean, it appears sort of in the margin of the book you've just written, but it is very much in the margin. I mean,
I don't think it is.
And
I think
also,
it's the subtext of the entire book.
Well, you should have made it the text, not the subtext.
It's also in the text, David.
Yeah, but I also think, your economic history is contentious. The extent to which rich countries slowed down the development of poor countries is a very, very complicated question. I mean, it may be partially true, but they may also have sped it up, with infrastructure and so on. And in any case, now, and indeed not just now, but for the last few decades, we've been in an unprecedented situation in which rich countries actually want poor countries, okay, sometimes somewhat hypocritically in terms of the way that trade is managed, but at least there is a rhetoric, and often more than just a rhetoric, of the richest countries in the world want the poor countries to flourish. And they don't want to flourish at their own expense or at the expense of their own citizens. We live in democracies. Politicians wouldn't last very long if they were logical universalists. We all believe in the moral equality of all human beings, but very, very few of us believe we have the same obligations to all human beings. Our obligations sort of ripple out from attachments to sort of family and friends and neighborhoods and towns and countries and to the whole globe. Virtually nobody is a logical universalist in genuinely thinking that they have the same obligation to everybody, and certainly not democratic politicians, and I don't blame them. But we've never been more open we positively want poor countries to become as rich as possible. We don't want them to become as rich as possible through sending their, or at least, this is what, the logic of more open immigration is the brain drain problem. We take the ablest and most energetic citizens from poor countries. They come here, and if I was one of them, obviously I would want to do that too. They kind of short circuit the historical process by moving from a poor country to a rich country, rather than staying in their own countries and catching up with us. The United States decided to let China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, actually at the expense of many of its citizens, which did lead to, we had the slight hiccup of Donald Trump as a result of that, or partially as a result of that. So actually, that is an example against my own argument that on whole democratic societies don't do things against the interests of their citizens, because actually America did do something very definitely against the interests of a section of its citizens whose livelihoods were wiped out by much cheaper Chinese imports. So I just don't think it's true that the kind of Western world is kind of ruthless and has no interest but how countries develop is often still a bit of a mystery. That right combination of a state that's neither too strong nor too weak, a rule of law that overcomes tribalism and so on and so forth. These things did happen to emerge in Europe, and through chance and geography and all sorts of other things, and historical accident, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And we are enormously lucky because of that. But we want to extend our luck to the rest of the global population too, but not through bringing their brightest and best to our countries. That seems to me an absolute crazy way of doing it.
Yes, Felix, I want you to come back on that. But obviously, we have another question that touches exactly on that. Would that not exacerbate global inequality if the most energetic and talented people move and leave the rest of their country people behind?
So this book is not about, it's just the New Nomads is not an argument in favor of people from poor countries all moving to rich countries. It just isn't that. It's an argument about, it's a book about what happens to us when we leave home, and why that is not, that instinct and the virtues of doing that don't go against the fact that we still, at the end of the day, need to build a home, and we need to. The journey of the migrant is a search for a home, and so questions about what happens if everyone comes to rich countries, like probably very complicated things happen, and I don't have the answer to what, I simply, that is not something where I have any kind of expertise, and I don't purport to have any. There's two things I take issue. I can't seem to choose between issue and issue. But with what David said, the first is, did we slow down these economies? I think the time will come, not very long time, when the idea of using the term, slowed down other economies to describe what happened will be extraordinarily shocking to really, like, anyone around. Like, this idea is, it's deeply problematic, and it shows to me that while we don't live in a colonial, in a colonial system anymore, we are surrounded by coloniality, i.e., the rationalization of the logic that led to the violence and the oppression of the colonial era. And when David talks about, liberal democracies and people who live them being in favor of poor countries doing, lifting up, if everyone in the world had the quality of life, the earnings, and therefore the spending of not Britain, but the average Slovenian, which is considerably poorer, again, like, our carbon emissions would be through the roof. I don't know what temperature it would be on Earth right now, but it would be something insane. Like, so there's, what I find fascinating when I listen to David is that there's a lot of, there's clearly a lot of smarts. He has, he has this classic political scientist approach to things, but it's sort of, there's these entire swaths of reality that are cut out because this is not my field of expertise. And I just say,
well, I'm an optimist. I mean, by the way, and I'm not a political scientist, Felix. I'm a journalist. I've never even studied political science, but I mean, I've probably read it.
You're often described as a political scientist.
Am I? Oh, right. Well, yeah. It's wrong. But I mean, I think that there have to be technical solutions to climate change. Otherwise, as you say, we're doomed. And I'm relatively optimistic. I mean, human ingenuity, gets us out of most tight corners. But what I like about your book actually is you're trying to overcome the cosmopolitan. You're giving an answer to the cosmopolitan paradox. The cosmopolitan. The idea that the cosmopolitan, somebody who like a butterfly, likes to flit from culture to culture, not necessarily having a perhaps rather a loose attachment to their own national culture. But of course, the problem with that is that if we're all cosmopolitans, then there are no cultures to flit between. And you get that, and so you're a rational cosmopolitan who wants to keep, embedded national cultures, and embedded national cultures require, you know, a critical mass of people who don't flit off anywhere. So I mean, I kind of doff my cap to your attempt to answer the cosmopolitan paradox, and I think you have a good bash at it.
I want to encourage all this doffing of caps, but I also want to get in one final question. This is a question from Agnieszka Wojcik. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's to you, David, but I'm sure that you'll want to come in on it as well, Felix, which is, do you expect a new type of migration resulting from the management of COVID in the Western world? For example, some people living in Western countries may want to escape totalitarian-like arrangements of control in a society that seems very likely to result in the post-COVID era.
Oh, that's rather an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought of that. Yeah, that it's a bit like this idea that eventually, when we have a sort of truly open, where everybody on the globe is kind of, you know, rich and happy, we will distribute not according to the random chance of where we were born, but according to our kind of personality type. So, you know, people will congregate in different parts of Britain. You know, the kind of the light-hearted people will be in one town, and the kind of rather gloomy people in another town. And I guess that's applying that idea to sort of COVID regulations. People, you know, lots of people in this country have rather embraced very draconian regulations, while other people have, as in all countries, there's been this sort of divide. And I mean, I think the answer, I mean, there are even now, even though we're more skeptical about the idea of, as it were, kind of national character, I mean, I think, you know, some national stereotypes are true or have a substantial element of truth about them. I mean, I have lived in one other country. I lived in Germany for 3.5 years, and it's clear quite a lot of German stereotypes are, well, you know this too, Felix, are true up to a point. It doesn't apply, obviously, to every single German. So you might say people already sort of have the option, if they're kind of rich and mobile enough, or, you know, have a mobile profession, they could choose to go and live in a country where, you know, the combination of sort of the weather and the national character, you know, is most enjoyable. In that case, though, you know, why doesn't everybody live in Italy? You know, perhaps that's the sort of, you know, why doesn't everybody live in Italy paradox.
Felix, what would you say to that? Why doesn't everyone live in Italy?
Everyone who could afford to, or, you know, is mobile and free enough to do so. Or on a Greek island.
I don't know. This reminds me. I live on a Greek island because my ancestors hail from here, and I realized after several years in Stockholm, David, that it just wasn't going to work for me.
The gloomy North Europeans drove you away.
Exactly. Although I wouldn't say it that way, and I have a Swedish daughter to show for it. So, but you know, at least some. I think it was Sacha Guitry who said the French are Italians in a bad mood, and I think that's why Italy might be a good place for some of us, some of those people that you describe, David. There's one thing there's another thing where I think I don't share your optimism, and that is this idea that technological developments are going to save the day. I think among others, you know, this book is about metaphysics, actually. But one of the things that nomads share, I would argue, is a reverence for the fact that what we know is infinitely smaller than what we don't know. And that actually most of the time technologies create as many problems, if not more, than they solve. And what we are facing right now when it comes to growth and extraction and carbon is behavioral issues. And technology does not save behavioral issues. It does not change our behavior. And
that's why I think technology has got to save us, because we're not going to change our behavior on a large scale.
I think, unfortunately, there's only one thing in my experience that does change human behavior in a sustained way, in a meaningful and sustained way, and it's pain. So my opinion on what will get us to actually change in the end is when a lot of people experience sufficient amounts of pain. Our huge problem today is that the people who are causing most of the harm don't live in the places where climate change is already ruining people's lives, such as Bangladesh, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel Desert, Nicaragua, Honduras, parts of India.
Well, Canada's getting pretty hot.
Yeah, yeah, but okay, but it's still the place. Yeah,
we are going to have to leave it there.
Stop.
It's not the place that I want to leave it. You know, about what we need to change is for us all to experience pain, but nonetheless, that is where we're leaving it, because for certainly, I know we're talking about how much national borders really matter, but there is a football match taking place in, yes, you're already dressed for the occasion there. And so whilst this discussion I know could go on for a very long time, I'm afraid I have to bring it to an end. I'm sure you all want to join me in thanking Felix and David for such an interesting conversation, and thank you for all your questions. They came in thick and fast, particularly at the end there. I wish we could have taken more of them. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now back to Connor.